For 6 years, Ella Harlan lived in absolute silence. Her father, a Hells Angels president, spent everything trying to fix it. Dozens of doctors, thousands of dollars, zero results. Then, a homeless 10-year-old black boy with no medical training walked up to her in a park, reached into her ear, and did the impossible. In 30 seconds, she heard sound for the first time in her life. But what that biker did for that homeless boy 60 seconds later, that's the part you never saw coming. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story, Daddy. The word hung in the air like a question mark shaped from hope alone. Ella Harlan's lips formed the sound carefully, deliberately, the way a sculptor might shape clay without ever seeing the final form. Her voice was soft, tentative, reaching out into a world she had never truly experienced. Marcus Harlan heard it, but Ella didn't. She couldn't hear anything. Not the rustle of her father's leather jacket as he turned toward her. Not the gentle creak of the floorboards beneath his boots. Not even the sound of her own voice calling out to him. For 6 years, Ella had lived in absolute silence. A silence so complete, so total that every word she spoke was nothing more than an educated guess. She remembered the shape of Daddy on her lips because she'd practiced it 1,000 times, watching her father's face light up each time she said it, trusting that she'd gotten it right. But she had never heard it. Not once. Marcus stood there in the doorway of their small Memphis home, watching his 6-year-old daughter try to navigate a world that existed only in silence. His jaw tightened, not from anger, not from frustration, but from a pain so deep, so profound, that it had carved permanent lines into his weathered face. This was a man who'd survived decades in the Hells Angels, a man who carried scars from fights, highways, and losses that would have broken most people. Marcus Iron Fist. Harlan wasn't a man easily shaken. But watching his daughter live in silence, that shook him every single day. Ella tilted her head slightly to the right, the way she always did when the discomfort came. Her small fingers reached up, tapping gently against her ear, trying to ease some invisible pressure that had been there for as long as anyone could remember. She winced, just barely, but Marcus caught it. He caught everything. He'd spent thousands of dollars trying to fix this. Audiologists, specialists, neurologists, ENT doctors with impressive credentials, and even more impressive bills. They'd all taken his money. They'd all run their tests. They'd all offered their theories. Nerve damage. Some said congenital defect. Others suggested developmental delay, structural abnormality. The medical jargon came fast and clinical, but the answers never did. Every appointment ended the same way with shrugs, apologies, and another referral to yet another specialist who couldn't help. Ella had learned to read lips. She'd learned to feel vibrations. She'd learned to exist in a world that moved and spoke and sang around her while she remained locked in silence. And she did it with more grace than most adults could manage. But Marcus saw the confusion in her eyes when other children laughed at something she couldn't hear. He saw the way she'd place her tiny hand on his chest when he spoke, trying to feel the rumble of his words since she couldn't hear them. He saw her frustration when she tried to sing along to songs she'd never heard, her voice slightly off-key, her timing just a beat behind. It wasn't fair. And Marcus Harlan, a man who'd made peace with most of life's injustices, couldn't make peace with this one. So, he did what he rarely allowed himself to do. He took a day off. He pushed aside the club business, the rides, the brotherhood obligations that usually consumed his time. He dressed Ella in her favorite red dress, the one that made her feel like a princess. Packed a small bag with snacks and juice boxes, and decided to take her to the neighborhood park. Maybe the sunshine would help. Maybe the swings would bring her joy. Maybe for just one afternoon, he could give her a moment of happiness that didn't require hearing. It was a small hope, a modest goal. But what Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known as he buckled Ella into his truck and headed toward that park, was that the answer to 6 years of silence was already there, waiting, sitting on a worn wooden bench just 20 feet from where they'd soon stand. And it wasn't a doctor. It wasn't a specialist with decades of training or access to expensive medical equipment. It was a 10-year-old homeless black boy who'd learned to survive by noticing what everyone else missed. If you've ever watched someone you love struggle with something you can't fix, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next proves that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. And if you believe in miracles, stick with me. The first doctor's appointment happened when Ella was 8 months old. Marcus had noticed it early. The way she didn't turn toward his voice, didn't startle at loud noises, didn't respond to the world of sound that surrounded her. The pediatrician was reassuring. "Give it time," she'd said. "Some babies develop slower than others," so Marcus gave it time. 6 months later, when Ella still hadn't responded to a single sound, he took her to a specialist, then another, then another. The waiting rooms all looked the same. Sterile, cold, filled with outdated magazines and the quiet desperation of parents seeking answers. Marcus sat in those chairs dozens of times, Ella on his lap, her small body nestled against his leather jacket, completely unaware of the conversations happening around her. The tests were exhaustive. Audiometry exams, tympanometry, auditory brain stem response testing, CT scans, MRI imaging, each one more expensive than the last, each one promising clarity that never came. "Mr. Harlan, the auditory nerve appears intact." "Mr. Harlan, there's no structural damage we can identify." "Mr. Harlan, this is quite unusual. We're not seeing the typical markers of congenital deafness." The medical terminology became a language Marcus learned to hate. Words like idiopathic and unexplained etiology and "we'll need to run more tests" became the soundtrack to his frustration. They weren't answers. They were expensive ways of saying "we don't know." Marcus paid every bill without hesitation. Money wasn't the issue. He'd spend every dollar he had if it meant giving Ella her hearing. But the problem was that no amount of money seemed to matter. One specialist suggested hearing aids. They fitted Ella with tiny devices that amplified sound she still couldn't process. She wore them for 3 months before the doctor admitted they weren't helping. Another recommended cochlear implants. Marcus researched them obsessively, stayed up nights reading medical journals and parent testimonials, prepared himself for the surgery. But when they did the pre-surgical evaluation, the surgeon shook his head. "Her case doesn't fit the typical profile. I'm not confident implants would be effective. More money, more tests, more appointments that ended with sympathetic looks and no solutions." What made it worse? What made Marcus's jaw clench and his hands ball into fists during those appointments was that Ella clearly felt something. She'd tilt her head to the right, always the right, and tap at her ear with those tiny fingers. Sometimes she'd wince. Sometimes she'd rub at it absently, like there was pressure building inside that she couldn't explain. Marcus mentioned it every single time. "Doctor, she keeps touching her right ear. Could there be something there? Some kind of blockage?" They'd look. They'd shine their lights and peer through their instruments and examine her ear canal with tools that cost more than most people's cars. Everything appears clear. "Mr. Harlan, the canal looks normal. There's no obstruction we can detect, but the ache remained." And Ella kept tilting her head, kept tapping, kept trying to ease a discomfort that every trained medical professional assured Marcus didn't exist. By the time Ella turned 6, Marcus had seen 17 different specialists. He'd spent over $40,000 on appointments, tests, scans, and consultations. He'd traveled to Nashville, Atlanta, even Birmingham, chasing recommendations and second opinions from doctors who claimed to be the best in their field. Every single one of them looked at Ella's ear. Every single one of them missed what mattered. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that every specialist failed to see what a 10-year-old black boy would spot in seconds. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because while Marcus was exhausting every medical option in Memphis, spending his days in sterile waiting rooms, and his nights researching miracle cures, another story was unfolding just 3 miles away. Meanwhile, 3 mi across Memphis, another child was fighting a completely different battle, one of survival. Jamal didn't remember his mother's face anymore. Not clearly, anyway, just fragments. The warmth of her hand holding his, the sound of her humming songs he could no longer name, the way she'd stroke his hair when thunder scared him at night. What he did remember with painful clarity was the night the shelter caught fire. He was 7 years old. The smoke alarm screamed through the building, pulling families from their cots and mattresses, sending everyone scrambling toward the exits in panic. Jamal remembered his mother pushing him forward, her hands firm on his shoulders, guiding him through the chaos towards safety. He made it out. She didn't. They told him it was smoke inhalation. They told him she didn't suffer. They told him a lot of things that were supposed to make a 7-year-old feel better about losing the only person who'd ever loved him. None of it helped. His father lasted another 8 months. 8 months of showing up drunk, then not showing up at all. 8 months of broken promises and empty apologies, until one morning Jamal woke up in their motel room and his father was just gone. No note, no explanation, no goodbye, just gone. Jamal was 8 years old, and he was completely alone. Most kids would have panicked, would have gone to authorities, to child services, to anyone who might help. But Jamal had learned early that the system didn't always work the way people claimed it did. He'd seen other kids disappear into foster care, bouncing from home to home, their eyes growing harder with each move. So Jamal made a different choice. He chose to survive on his own terms. He didn't beg. Something in him, pride maybe, or his mother's voice still echoing in his memory, refused to hold out his hand and ask for pity. He didn't steal either. His mother had taught him better than that. Instead, Jamal learned to help. He'd hover near diners during the morning rush, offering to bus tables or sweep floors in exchange for breakfast. He'd linger behind barber shops, helping elderly barbers carry out trash or sweep up hair clippings, earning a few dollars and sometimes a sandwich. He'd find food stalls at the edge of parking lots and volunteer to help vendors pack up at the end of the day, receiving whatever didn't sell. He lived in the corners of life, the spaces between buildings, the alleys behind restaurants, the park benches that nobody else wanted. He kept himself clean as best he could using gas station bathrooms. He wore the same faded cargo shorts and hand-me-down shirts until they were threadbare. And he learned to be invisible. When you're homeless and 10 years old, invisibility is survival. You don't draw attention. You don't make noise. You simply exist quietly, hoping nobody notices you long enough to ask questions you can't answer. But here's what happened. When Jamal became invisible to everyone else, he started seeing things other people missed. Jamal had a gift nobody knew about. A gift born from desperation. He could read pain in people's faces. He'd spent so long being invisible that he'd learned to see what others missed. The slight wince of an old woman with arthritis. The way a construction worker favored his left leg. The exhaustion in a waitress's eyes after a double shift. Jamal saw suffering because he knew it intimately. 6 months earlier, behind a diner on Beale Street, he noticed an elderly man sitting on a milk crate, tilting his head and tapping his ear in obvious discomfort. Jamal had approached carefully the way he always did, and asked if the man was okay. "Something stuck in there," the old man had muttered. "Been driving me crazy for days." Jamal had looked, and there, just visible in the ear canal, was a hardened mass of wax and debris compacted so tightly It had become a blockage. Jamal had seen similar things before. His mother had once helped a neighbor with the same problem, using warm water and patience. He'd helped the old man that day. Carefully, gently, and when the blockage finally came free, the relief on the man's face was immediate. Jamal never forgot that moment. If you can't stand how children like Jamal are forgotten by society, comment "Every child deserves a home" down below. Let's remind ourselves what matters. And that memory, that one random act of kindness behind a greasy diner, was about to save a little girl's world. The park on Riverside Drive wasn't much. A few swings with rusted chains, a slide that had seen better decades, patchy grass that turned brown every summer and barely recovered by fall. But it was quiet. And on that particular Tuesday afternoon, in late September 2015, it was exactly what Marcus needed. He pulled his truck into the gravel lot, killed the engine, and looked over at Ella in the passenger seat. She was already unbuckling herself, her eyes bright with excitement at the prospect of an afternoon outside. Marcus managed a small smile. This was all he wanted. Just one good day. One afternoon where his daughter could feel joy without the weight of her silence pressing down on both of them. Ella ran ahead toward the swings, her red dress catching the sunlight, her small feet kicking up dust as she moved. Marcus followed at a slower pace, his boots heavy on the ground, his mind still turning over the latest failed doctor's appointment from 3 days earlier. He was tired, not physically, but tired in the way that comes from years of trying and failing. Tired of hope that led nowhere. 20 left away, sitting on a worn wooden bench near the basketball court, Jamal watched them arrive. He'd been there for about an hour, his usual spot when he needed somewhere to rest during the day. The park was safe. Families came and went. Nobody paid attention to a quiet black kid on a bench. As long as he didn't cause trouble, didn't approach anyone, didn't draw attention, he could sit there for hours without anyone asking questions. Jamal had learned to occupy himself by observing. Watching people became both entertainment and education. He'd study how families interacted, how parents responded to their children, how people moved through the world with the casual confidence that came from having a home to return to. He noticed everything. So when Ella walked past him toward the swings, Jamal noticed immediately the way her head tilted slightly to the right. The casual, almost unconscious movement of her hand reaching up to tap at her ear. The exact angle of discomfort he'd seen before. Jamal sat up straighter. Ella climbed onto the swing, her father pushing her gently from behind. She smiled, but every few seconds, her hand would drift back to her right ear. The tapping, the gentle pressure she applied with her fingertips, trying to ease something nobody else seemed to notice. Jamal's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward on the bench, watching more carefully now. The sunlight hit Ella's face at just the right angle as she turned her head. And that's when Jamal saw it, deep inside her ear canal, barely visible, but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. A dark mass, compacted, lodged firmly, the kind of blockage that wouldn't come out on its own, the kind that could cause pressure, discomfort, and if it was positioned just right against the eardrum, complete hearing loss. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He knew exactly what that was. He'd seen it before. He'd removed one before. And suddenly, with a clarity that sent electricity through his entire body, he understood. This little girl wasn't just uncomfortable. She was deaf because of that blockage. And nobody, not her father, not the doctors, not anyone, had seen it. Jamal's heart started pounding. His hands gripped the edge of the wooden bench until his knuckles turned white. He could help her. He knew he could. It would take 30 seconds, maybe less. One careful extraction and that little girl could hear for the first time in who knows how long. But Jamal also knew what would happen if he approached her. He'd spent 2 years learning to be invisible precisely because approaching people especially children, when you looked like he did, was dangerous. The father was right there. A big man, intimidating. The kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to protect his daughter from a strange, barefoot black kid with scraped knees and unwashed clothes. If Jamal approached her, the man might grab him, might hurt him, might call the police. And then what? Foster care questions he couldn't answer. The end of his freedom. But if he didn't approach her, that little girl would stay deaf forever. When the solution was right there, when he could fix it in seconds, Jamal's heart started racing. He knew exactly what was wrong. But he also knew what would happen if he approached a biker's daughter uninvited. He had seconds to decide. Stay safe and invisible, or risk everything to help. Jamal's decision came in the space between heartbeats. One moment, he was frozen on that bench, paralyzed by fear and self-preservation. The next, his body was moving before his mind could talk him out of it. He jumped up, his bare feet hitting the dusty ground with purpose. Ella had stepped off the swing and was wandering toward the slide, her hands still drifting to her ear every few seconds. She was maybe 15 feet away from Jamal now, moving in that casual, aimless way children do when they're exploring their surroundings. Jamal started walking toward her. His heart hammered so violently in his chest he thought it might crack his ribs. Every survival instinct he had honed over 2 years of living on the streets screamed at him to stop, to sit back down, to stay invisible. But he kept walking. Ella turned slightly, noticing the boy approaching. She tilted her head. Curious but not afraid. She couldn't hear his footsteps, couldn't hear the urgency in his breathing. She just saw another kid, barefoot and skinny, moving toward her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Marcus saw too. The reaction was immediate and primal. Marcus's body shifted between Jamal and Ella before conscious thought even registered. His hand came up, palm out, a barrier of flesh and authority. "Hey!" Marcus's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade. "Back up." Jamal stopped immediately, his hands raised slightly, showing he meant no harm, but he didn't back away. His eyes were locked on Ella, specifically on her right ear, and the urgency in his face was unmistakable. "I'm sorry," Jamal said quickly, his voice higher than he wanted it to be, cracking slightly with nervousness. "I'm sorry, but please," I said. "Back up, kid." Marcus's tone left no room for negotiation. He was a full foot taller than Jamal, broader, harder, a man who'd spent decades making people listen when he spoke. But Jamal shook his head, the movement quick and desperate. "Please," he repeated. And this time, there was something in his voice that made Marcus hesitate. Not fear, not manipulation, just raw, genuine concern. "Something's in her ear. I can see it. I think I can help." Marcus's jaw tightened. This was Memphis. Homeless kids approached people all the time with stories, with angles, with reasons why you should give them money or attention or trust. Marcus had heard them all. He developed a thick skin against sob stories and manipulation. But this kid wasn't asking for money, wasn't even looking at Marcus. His entire focus was on Ella. And the expression on his face was one Marcus recognized because he'd seen it in the mirror for 6 years. Desperation to help someone who was suffering. Marcus's hand shot out and grabbed Jamal's wrist. Not violently, but firmly. A warning and a restraint all at once. "You've got 5 seconds to explain yourself," Marcus said quietly. The kind of quiet that was more threatening than shouting. Jamal looked up at him. Those sharp eyes that had seemed too much for a 10-year-old, meeting Marcus's without flinching. "There's something stuck in her ear," Jamal said, speaking fast but clearly. "A blockage deep in the canal. I can see it from here when the light hits right. It's been there a long time. That's why she keeps touching it. That's why she tilts her head. I've helped with this before. I know what to do. Please, just let me try. If you're holding your breath right now, you're not alone. Hit that like button if you want to see this boy prove everyone wrong. Marcus stared at him. His grip on Jamal's wrist didn't loosen, but something shifted in his expression. Doubt, maybe, or desperate hope, wearing the disguise of skepticism. Ella stood there between them, unaware of the tension, her hand once again drifting to her ear. Marcus made his decision. He didn't release Jamal's wrist. Not yet. But he stepped aside just enough to give the boy a narrow path to his daughter. What happened in the next 10 seconds would either end in a homeless boy getting hurt or a miracle no one saw coming. Jamal moved slowly, deliberately, every motion telegraphed and careful, as if approaching a frightened animal. Ella watched him with curious eyes, her head tilted in that familiar way, completely unaware that the next 30 seconds would change her entire world. I need to look in her ear, Jamal said softly, more to Marcus than to Ella. I won't hurt her, I promise. Marcus's grip on Jamal's wrist tightened for just a moment. A final warning, a final hesitation, and then loosened slightly. Not a release, just enough slack for Jamal to move. Jamal knelt down, bringing himself to Ella's eye level. He smiled at her, trying to look reassuring despite his nervousness. Ella smiled back, innocent and trusting in the way only children can be. Hi, Jamal whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear him. This might feel weird for a second, but I'm going to help you, okay? Ella's eyes searched his face, reading his expression the way she'd learned to read the world. Through sight alone, through the shape of mouths and the softness of eyes. Jamal leaned in closer. His right hand came up, fingers extended, approaching Ella's right ear with the kind of precision that seemed impossible for a 10-year-old boy. But Jamal had learned precision from necessity. When you survive by helping others, you learn to be gentle, to be careful, to do no harm. Marcus stood over them both, his body coiled tight as a spring, his hand still wrapped around Jamal's wrist. One wrong move, one indication that this kid meant harm. One cry from Ella, and Marcus would pull him away so fast the boy's feet would leave the ground, but Jamal's fingers were steady. He tilted Ella's head just slightly, angling it to catch the afternoon sunlight. And there it was, the dark mass visible now that he was close enough. Hardened wax and debris compacted over years, lodged deep against her eardrum like a cork in a bottle. Jamal's index finger and thumb moved into position. Slow, careful, his touch was feather light as he made contact with the obstruction. Ella's eyes widened slightly at the sensation. Foreign, strange, but not painful. Marcus's breathing stopped entirely. His grip tightened again on Jamal's wrist, knuckles white, ready to yank the boy back at the first sign of distress from his daughter. Jamal began to pull. Not roughly, not quickly, just steady, gentle pressure, easing the mass free from where it had been wedged for who knows how long. Seconds stretched into eternity. The obstruction resisted at first, held in place by years of compression. Jamal adjusted his angle slightly, his young face a mask of concentration. His bottom lip caught between his teeth, and then it moved. The thick, compact mass began to slide free, millimeter by millimeter, drawn out by Jamal's careful extraction. It was larger than Marcus expected, darker, coated in old wax and debris that had accumulated and hardened into something that looked almost solid. Jamal held it in his fingers for just a moment. Proof, evidence, the answer to 6 years of medical failures. And then it fell away. Silence, a beat of absolute nothing. Ella stood completely still, her eyes unfocused, her expression frozen somewhere between confusion and fear. Something had changed. something fundamental, something she couldn't yet name. And then her breath hitched. A sharp, sudden intake of air that had nothing to do with breathing and everything to do with shock. Her eyes widened, pupils dilating, her entire body going rigid with the overwhelming sensation of sound flooding into her consciousness for the first time in her life. The breeze rustled through the oak trees at the edge of the park, leaves whispering secrets she'd never heard before. Children laughed on the far side of the playground, their voices carrying across the open space like bells. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, sharp and clear and real. Marcus exhaled sharply, a sound of tension and disbelief and desperate hope all mixed together. And Ella heard it all. Her hands flew to her ears, both of them, as if trying to confirm that the sensation was real. Her lips trembled, her chin quivered. Tears spilled down her cheeks, hot and fast, and unstoppable. She looked up at her father, this man she'd known her entire life, but had never truly heard. And her voice came out cracked and broken and more beautiful than any sound Marcus had ever heard in his life. "Daddy," she whispered, the words shaped by memory, but heard for the very first time. "I hear you, Daddy." Iron Fist Harlan had been in bar fights that left men unconscious. He'd ridden through thunderstorms that turned highways into rivers. He'd buried brothers who died too young and stood at gravesides without shedding a tear, because that's what being strong meant in his world. But hearing his daughter say, "I hear you," for the first time in her life, that broke him completely. His knees went weak, actually weak. The toughest man in Tennessee felt his legs tremble beneath him, felt the ground shift like he'd been hit with something he couldn't fight back against. He released Jamal's wrist, forgot he was even holding it, and dropped into a crouch in front of Ella. His hands reaching for her face, needing to see her eyes, needing to confirm this was real. Ella's hands were still pressed against her ears, fingers trembling, her entire body vibrating with the overwhelming sensation of a world that had suddenly become alive with sound. Every rustle, every breath, every footstep on gravel in the parking lot. "Daddy?" she said again, and this time she heard herself say it, her own voice. The sound shocked her so much she gasped, which made another sound, which made her gasp again. She started crying, not from pain or fear, but from the sheer magnitude of everything flooding into her consciousness at once. "I can hear," she whispered, testing the words, hearing them vibrate in her throat and emerge into the air as something real, something she could perceive. "Daddy, I can hear me, I can hear you, I can hear everything." Her voice rose with each word, climbing from whisper to speaking volume, as if she needed to test the full range of what sound meant. And Marcus, this hardened man who'd spent decades building walls around his emotions, felt every single one of those walls crumble into dust. Tears poured down his face. Not quiet tears, not dignified ones, but the kind that come from somewhere deep in the chest, from a place that holds 6 years of helplessness and frustration. And watching your child struggle with something you couldn't fix, no matter how hard you tried. He pulled Ella into his arms and held her so tight it probably hurt. But she didn't complain. She pressed her ear against his chest and listened to his heartbeat. Actually heard it for the first time in her life. "The leaves," she said, her voice muffled against his leather jacket. "Daddy, the leaves are making noise and the wind and that dog. Is that a dog?" Marcus couldn't speak. His throat had closed completely. All he could do was nod and hold her and cry, in a way he hadn't cried since he was a child himself. And then he remembered Jamal. Marcus looked up, his vision blurred with tears, and found the boy standing a few feet away. Jamal had backed up after the extraction, giving them space, his bare feet shifting nervously on the dusty ground. His face carried an expression Marcus had seen before on the faces of combat veterans, the look of someone who'd just done something impossible and couldn't quite process it themselves. 6 years, thousands of dollars, dozens of specialists with impressive degrees and expensive equipment and access to the latest medical technology. And a barefoot 10-year-old black boy did what none of them could. Marcus stood slowly, still holding Ella against his chest with one arm. He looked at Jamal, really looked at him, seeing not just a homeless kid, but someone who'd just fundamentally altered the course of his daughter's entire life. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice shook in a way none of his bikers had ever heard. Not from anger, not from intimidation, but from gratitude so profound it changed the texture of every word. "Kid," Marcus breathed, barely getting the word out. "You changed my little girl's life." Jamal shrugged slightly, almost apologetically, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I just wanted to help," he said quietly. "If you believe this boy deserves everything after what he just did, comment Jamal is a hero. If you think kids like him should never be homeless, share this story. Make some noise for the invisible children." Marcus wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing tears across weathered skin. And in that moment, looking at this skinny, barefoot boy who'd given him a miracle, Marcus made a decision that would change 3 lives forever. Marcus didn't think. There was no internal debate, no weighing of options or consideration of consequences. Some decisions bypass the mind entirely and come straight from somewhere deeper. From the gut, from the heart, from whatever part of a person recognizes truth when it stands in front of them. This was one of those decisions. Marcus looked at Jamal, this child who'd spent 2 years surviving alone, who'd approached a stranger's daughter despite every instinct telling him to stay invisible, who'd risked everything to help someone he didn't know, and saw something he recognized. He saw someone worth protecting. Marcus's hands moved to his shoulders, fingers finding the worn leather of his Hell's Angels vest. The cut, as they called it, the sacred garment that represented everything he was, everything he had earned over decades of loyalty and brotherhood. It was warm from the Tennessee sun, heavy with the weight of patches and pins and memories stitched into every inch of leather. He lifted it off. The movement was slow, deliberate, ceremonial, like removing a crown to place it on another's head. Jamal watched with wide eyes, not understanding what was happening, his body tensing as if preparing to run. Marcus stepped forward, closing the distance between them in 2 strides, and then he draped the vest over Jamal's small shoulders. The leather swallowed the boy. It hung past his waist, the armholes gaping, the bottom hem nearly reaching his knees. Jamal stood there frozen, his thin frame barely filling a quarter of the space that Marcus's broad shoulders had occupied moments before. But the weight of it, the actual physical weight of leather and history and belonging, settled onto Jamal's shoulders like an anchor, like something solid in a world that had been weightless and uncertain for too long. "You're not alone anymore," Marcus said, his voice rough but steady now, each word carefully placed like stones building a foundation. "You stay with us now." Jamal's lips parted, but no sound came out. His eyes went glassy with tears. He was trying desperately not to shed. His hands came up slowly, fingers touching the leather as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. "I can't." Jamal's voice cracked completely. "I'm nobody. You're my daughter's miracle." Marcus interrupted his tone, leaving no room for argument. "That makes you family. And family doesn't sleep on park benches. Family doesn't go hungry. Family doesn't survive. Family lives. You understand me?" Jamal nodded, though his face suggested he didn't quite believe what was happening. Kids who'd been abandoned, learned not to trust good things, learned that kindness usually came with conditions, with expectations, with expiration dates. But there was something in Marcus's eyes, something unshakable and absolute that cut through Jamal's defenses like a blade through paper. Ella pulled away from her father just enough to look at Jamal, her face still wet with tears, but lit up with joy that made her look like she was glowing from the inside. "You're staying?" she asked, her voice full of wonder and hope, testing this new ability to hear her own questions. Jamal looked down at her, then back at Marcus, then down at the vest, drowning his small frame. "I'm staying," he whispered. And saying it out loud made it feel real in a way nothing had felt real in 2 years. Marcus placed his hand on top of Jamal's head, the gesture somewhere between a blessing and a claim. This boy was his now, his responsibility, his family. "We'll get you cleaned up," Marcus said, his mind already moving through logistics, through what Jamal would need. Food, clothes, a bed, school enrollment, medical care, everything a child should have had all along. Get you fed, get you home. Home. Jamal had forgotten what that word meant. But Marcus wasn't the only one who'd have a say in Jamal's future. When the rest of the Brotherhood heard what happened, something unprecedented occurred. Word traveled fast in the Hells Angels. Marcus made one phone call from the park, just one, to his vice president, a man named Zeke, who'd ridden beside him for 15 years. Marcus's voice was still shaking when he explained what had happened, what Jamal had done, what he decided. "Bring everyone to the clubhouse," Marcus said. "I need the brothers to meet someone." Within an hour, motorcycles began rolling into the parking lot of the Hells Angels clubhouse on the east side of Memphis. The rumble of engines announced each arrival. Deep, throaty roars that vibrated through the walls and rattled the windows. One bike, then 3, then 7, then a dozen men climbed off their machines, pulling helmets free, their leather cuts bearing the same red and white patches that Marcus wore. These were men society had labeled as dangerous, as outlaws, as people to be feared and avoided. And they were all gathering to meet a 10-year-old homeless black boy. Jamal stood in the corner of the clubhouse common room, still wearing Marcus's oversized vest, trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. Ella sat beside him on a worn couch, her hand clasped in his, refusing to let go. She kept tilting her head in different directions, discovering new sounds. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of floorboards, the distant traffic outside. The bikers filed in their boots heavy on concrete floors, massive men with scarred knuckles and weathered faces, men who'd seen violence and survived it, men who trusted no one outside their brotherhood. They looked at Jamal with expressions that made the boy's stomach clench with fear. But then Marcus told them the story. He stood in the center of the room, Ella on his hip now, and explained everything. The 6 years of silence, the failed doctors, the park, Jamal's observation, the extraction, Ella's first words after hearing sound. "This kid," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "gave my daughter something I couldn't buy, something specialists with fancy degrees couldn't provide. He gave her the world." The room fell silent. One of the older bikers, a man called Bolt, whose real name nobody remembered anymore, stepped forward. His face was a road map of scars and sun damage, his eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. He looked Jamal up and down, taking in the bare feet, the dirty clothes, the fear barely hidden behind defensive eyes. "How old are you, kid?" Bolt asked, his voice gravelly from decades of cigarettes and shouting over engine noise. 10, Jamal answered quietly, his voice almost disappearing into the ambient sounds of the room. Bolt nodded slowly. Then he looked at Marcus. "He got people? Family somewhere?" "No," Marcus said simply. "He's been surviving on his own for 2 years." Something shifted in the room. The atmosphere changed in a way that was almost tangible. These men who rarely trusted outsiders, who'd been rejected by society themselves, who'd built their own family precisely because the world had pushed them out, didn't see Jamal as charity. They saw themselves in him. Every single one of them had a story. An absent father, an abusive home, a system that failed them, a world that decided they were worthless before they were old enough to prove otherwise. They'd all been Jamal at some point, alone, struggling, surviving on instinct and desperation. Zeke, the vice president, spoke next. He was younger than Marcus, but carried the same authority, the same presence that came from earning respect rather than demanding it. President's making him family, Zeke said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Anyone got a problem with that? Silence. Then Bolt stepped forward again, this time approaching Jamal directly. The boy tensed, every muscle in his body preparing to run. Even though he had nowhere to go, Bolt extended his hand. "Welcome home, kid," he said simply. Jamal stared at the offered hand for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was real or some elaborate setup for disappointment. Then slowly he reached out and shook it. His small hand disappeared completely inside Bolt's calloused grip. One by one, the other bikers stepped forward. Each one shook Jamal's hand. Each one welcomed him, not with pity, not with condescension, but with the same respect they'd show any prospect joining their ranks. "We'll set him up in the back room," someone said. "Kid needs clothes," another added. "I've got nephews about his size. I'll bring some things tomorrow. School." A third voice chimed in. "He'll need to get enrolled. My old lady works at the district office. She can help with that." The logistics came fast. Each brother offering something practical, something concrete. This was no empty charity. This wasn't a feel-good gesture that would fade when the emotion wore off. This was a brotherhood absorbing a new member, making space in their lives for someone who needed them. Marcus watched it happen with something close to awe. He'd expected support. His brothers always had his back. But this was different. This was unanimous, instant, and absolute. Jamal wasn't being tolerated. He was being claimed. By the end of the evening, Jamal had a room at the clubhouse. Not a cot in a corner, but an actual room, with a door that locked from the inside, and a bed with clean sheets. He had a drawer full of clothes that would arrive the next day. He had a list of brothers who'd volunteered to help him with homework, teach him to ride safely when he was old enough, show him how to fix engines and change oil, and survive with dignity. He had protection. He had structure. He had family. But the most beautiful part, it wasn't even over yet because Ella had one more gift to give Jamal. And it happened every single night. Jamal's first night in the clubhouse. He didn't sleep. He lay in that bed with clean sheets and a pillow that didn't smell like mildew or exhaust fumes, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for someone to burst through the door and tell him it was all a mistake, that he didn't belong, that he needed to leave. But morning came, and no one told him to go. Marcus knocked on his door at 7, carrying a plate of eggs and toast that one of the brothers had cooked in the clubhouse kitchen. Jamal ate slowly, still not quite trusting that the food wouldn't be taken away, that this wasn't temporary. "You'll need boots," Marcus said, watching Jamal eat. "Can't have you walking around barefoot anymore. We'll get you sorted today." And that's exactly what happened. By noon, Jamal had boots, real ones, with thick soles and laces that actually stayed tied. He had jeans that fit, t-shirts that didn't have holes, a jacket for when the Tennessee nights got cold. He stood in front of a mirror in the clubhouse bathroom and barely recognized himself. He looked like a kid who belonged somewhere. The transformation wasn't just external. Over the following weeks, the Brotherhood absorbed Jamal into their daily rhythm. Bolt taught him how engines worked, the difference between two-stroke and four-stroke, how to diagnose problems by sound alone, how to rebuild a carburetor with patience and precision. Jamal learned fast, his hands steady and careful. That same competence he'd shown helping strangers now channeled into something constructive. Zeke took him to the motorcycle safety course, explaining road rules and defensive driving, even though Jamal was years away from being able to ride legally. "Knowledge first," Zeke said. "Speed later. You stay alive by being smart, not reckless." Another brother, a quiet man named Preach, who rarely spoke but listened to everything, taught Jamal about honor, about keeping your word, about the difference between surviving and living with dignity. "You never begged," Preach said one afternoon while they were cleaning bikes in the clubhouse garage. "You never stole. You survived by helping people. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." Jamal looked up from the chrome. He was polishing, surprised. "You noticed that?" Marcus told us. Preach said simply. "And yeah, we noticed. That's why you're here, kid. Not because we felt sorry for you, but because you've got character. You've got integrity. Those things matter more than blood. Remember, Jamal never begged, never stole. He survived by helping. And now, for the first time, people were helping him back." The change in Jamal was visible. Not overnight. Healing never happens overnight, but gradually, like spring thaw, revealing ground that had been frozen for too long. His shoulders straightened. His eyes lost that constant wariness, that perpetual scanning for threats. He smiled more, laughed, even when one of the brothers told a terrible joke, or when Ella insisted on showing him another sound she discovered. Marcus enrolled him in school, the local elementary, 5th grade. Jamal had missed significant chunks of education during his 2 years on the streets, but he caught up fast. Turned out a kid who'd learned to survive by reading people and situations was also pretty good at reading books. His teachers noticed something unusual about him, a maturity beyond his years, a kindness toward other kids who seemed lost or alone. During lunch, Jamal would seek out the children sitting by themselves and ask if he could join them. He recognized isolation because he'd lived it. If this is making you emotional, you're human. Subscribe if you believe every child deserves this kind of second chance. Comment family isn't blood. If you agree that love is a choice. By the time October rolled into November, Jamal had been with the Brotherhood for 6 weeks. He had routine stability. He woke up in the same bed every morning, ate meals at regular times, did homework at the clubhouse dining table while bikers drank coffee, and argued about carburetors and politics. He had a life. But there was one part of his new reality that meant more to him than all the rest combined. One ritual that happened every single evening without fail, and it involved the little girl who'd been the catalyst for everything. Every evening at 7:30, without fail, Ella would appear at Jamal's door. She'd knock. 3 soft taps that she could finally hear herself making, and wait for him to answer. When he opened the door, she'd be standing there in her pajamas, her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Is it time?" she'd ask, even though she already knew the answer. "It's time," Jamal would reply, smiling. And then Ella would take his hand and lead him to the clubhouse common room, to the old couch near the window, and they'd sit together in the gathering darkness while she discovered the world. It had started accidentally that first week after the park. Ella had been overwhelmed by sound. Every noise was new, every sensation unfamiliar and sometimes frightening. A door slamming made her cry. A motorcycle engine starting made her cover her ears. The sheer volume of existence was too much all at once. But Jamal understood overwhelm. He'd lived it in a different way. So he'd sat with her one evening and started naming things, identifying sounds, giving her context for the chaos flooding her senses. "That's the refrigerator," he'd said, pointing toward the kitchen. "It hums because of the motor inside. It's keeping food cold." Ella had listened, her head tilted, focusing on the soft electrical hum she'd never known existed. "And that?" she'd asked, pointing toward the window. "Crickets," Jamal had answered. "Little insects outside. They rubbed their legs together to make that chirping sound." Her face had lit up with wonder. And so it became their ritual. Every night, Ella would sit beside Jamal, her tiny fingers tugging at his sleeve whenever she heard something new, something she couldn't identify, something that needed explanation. "Jamal, what's that sound?" became the question that shaped their evenings together. Jamal was endlessly patient. He never seemed annoyed by her constant questions, her need to categorize and understand every auditory detail of the world around her. He'd lean close, listen carefully, and then explain. "That's someone walking upstairs. You can tell by the rhythm. Step, 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 that's Bolt. He walks heavy. That's wind chimes from the house next door. Little metal tubes that make music when the breeze moves them. That's your own laughter, Ella. That's what joy sounds like when it comes out of you." That last one had made her laugh even harder, delighted by the discovery that happiness had a sound, and that sound was hers. The reversal wasn't lost on Marcus, who often watched them from across the room. The boy who'd once been invisible, who'd survived in corners and alleys with no one to talk to, was now teaching, guiding, becoming someone's bridge to understanding. And the girl who'd lived in silence, who'd navigated the world through sight alone, was now asking questions, engaging, discovering that sound gave dimension to everything she'd only seen before. They needed each other in ways that went beyond gratitude or obligation. Jamal gave Ella context. Ella gave Jamal purpose. Together they were healing wounds neither of them had words for. One evening, about a month after moving in, Ella discovered her own voice in a new way. She'd been humming, testing pitch and tone, experimenting with the vibration in her throat, when she suddenly stopped and looked at Jamal with wide eyes. "I can make any sound I want," she said, as if the realization had just struck her. "You can," Jamal confirmed, smiling. "Any sound in the whole world. Any sound." She tested this immediately, started making noises. Silly ones, experimental ones, sounds that had no purpose except to exist. Animal sounds, made-up words, long vowels that stretched and changed pitch. Jamal sat beside her, encouraging every exploration, never once suggesting she should be quiet or contained. The other bikers would sometimes pause their card games or their conversations to watch these two children, one teaching, one learning, and shake their heads in amazement at what had brought them all together. But there was one sound Ella wanted to hear more than any other. And when it finally happened, it broke everyone who witnessed it. 6 months changed everything. It was March 2016, when the Brotherhood gathered for what had become their monthly family dinner, a tradition that predated Jamal's arrival, but had taken on new meaning since he joined them. The clubhouse dining area was packed, long tables pushed together, mismatched chairs filled with bikers and their families, the air thick with the smell of grilled meat and laughter and belonging. Jamal sat in the middle of it all, surrounded by men who'd become his uncles, his teachers, his protectors. He wore a new vest now, not Marcus's oversized cut, but one made specifically for him. Leather still stiff and unmarked by road miles, but bearing a small patch that read "Little Brother" across the back. Ella sat beside him, as she always did, chattering excitedly about something that had happened at school. Her voice had grown stronger over the months, more confident. She spoke constantly now, making up for 6 years of enforced silence, and nobody minded the endless stream of words because each one was a miracle they'd never take for granted. Marcus watched them from across the room, a beer in his hand, a smile on his face that his brothers claimed had become permanent. Zeke stood beside him, following his gaze. "You did good, Prez," Zeke said quietly. Marcus shook his head. "Jamal did good. I just recognized it." The dinner continued. Food passed, stories shared. The kind of easy chaos that comes when family gathers without pretense or formality. Jamal was laughing at something Bolt had said. His face lit up in a way that erased every trace of the scared, barefoot boy from the park. And then Ella stood up on her chair. The movement caught everyone's attention. Conversations paused, heads turned. Ella was small for 6 years old, but standing on that chair, she commanded the room with the unself-conscious authority only children possess. She cupped her hands around her mouth, took a deep breath, and shouted at the top of her lungs, "I love you, Jamal." Her voice carried through the entire clubhouse, clear and strong, and filled with every ounce of affection a child's heart could hold. And this time, unlike every other time she tried to express love in her life, she heard herself say it, heard the words leave her mouth and travel through the air and land exactly where she intended them to go. The room went completely silent. Jamal's face crumpled, just completely fell apart. Tears streamed down his cheeks before he could even try to stop them, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotion he'd been holding back for months, maybe years, maybe his entire life, because Jamal had never heard those words before. Not once. Not from his mother before she died. Not from his father before he left. Not from anyone in the 2 years he'd spent invisible and alone. He'd survived by being unwanted, by being forgettable, by accepting that love was something other people had, not something meant for him. But Ella, this little girl whose world he'd opened with one careful extraction, was shouting her love for him loud enough for everyone to hear. And she meant it. And he could hear it. Jamal couldn't speak, could barely breathe. He just sat there crying while Ella climbed down from her chair and threw her arms around his neck, holding him with the fierce protectiveness of a little sister who'd claimed him as her own. Marcus moved then, crossed the room in 3 long strides, and placed his hand on Jamal's shoulder, heavy, warm, unmistakable in its meaning. "You're my son now," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you are my children." Jamal looked up at him, tears still streaming, and nodded because words were impossible. If you're crying, hit that like button. You're not alone. If you believe love like this should be shared, send this to someone who needs to remember that miracles are real. And if you want more stories that restore your faith in humanity, subscribe because I've got plenty more. The boy who lived in corners was now at the center of everything. The girl who lived in silence now filled every room with sound. And the family that had formed in a park on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon was now unbreakable. 8 years have passed since that afternoon in the park. Jamal is 18 now. He's taller, his voice deeper, his bare feet long since replaced by boots he wears with the same pride he wears his vest. He's a senior at Memphis Central High School. And if you ask his teachers about him, they'll tell you he's one of the best students they've ever had. Not because he's naturally gifted, though he's certainly bright, but because he works harder than anyone else. Because he understands that education is a privilege, not a burden. Because he remembers what it felt like to have nothing. And he's determined never to waste the second chance he's been given. He's at the top of his class on the honor roll every semester. But more than that, he's become the kid who notices others, who finds the students eating lunch alone and sits with them, who helps struggling classmates with homework, who sees the invisible children because he used to be one. His teachers call him an old soul. His classmates call him a friend. The brotherhood calls him family. Ella is 14 now, thriving in ways that seemed impossible just 8 years ago. Her hearing remains fully functional. No complications, no regression. She's in speech therapy. Not because she needs it, but because she wants to. Determined to make up for lost time, to master every nuance of communication she'd missed during those silent years. She's learning piano, joined the school choir, spends her afternoons discovering music the way other children discover sports or art. Sound, which was once absent from her world, has become her passion. And every single night, she still sits with Jamal, not to ask, "What's that sound?" anymore. She knows most of them now, but simply to be near the person who gave her everything. But the story didn't end with Jamal and Ella. 6 months after Jamal moved into the clubhouse, Marcus called a formal meeting of the Memphis chapter. All members present. He stood before them with a proposal that would change the direction of their brotherhood. "We've got space here," Marcus had said. "We've got resources. We've got brothers who know what it's like to be forgotten. So here's what I'm proposing. We start a program for homeless kids. Kids like Jamal who were surviving alone because the system failed them. The vote was unanimous. They called it Jamal's Law, not a legal statute, but a code within their chapter. A commitment that any child in genuine need, any kid surviving on the streets without family or support would have a place with them. Not as charity cases, not as projects, but as family. Within a year, 3 more children had found homes within the Brotherhood. A 15-year-old girl who'd been couch surfing after aging out of foster care. Twin boys whose mother had died and whose father was serving time. A 14-year-old who'd run from an abusive household and refused to go back. Each one was vetted carefully. Each one was given structure, protection, education, and belonging. Each one was taught the same lessons Jamal had learned. That family isn't about blood, it's about choice. That survival isn't enough. You have to live with dignity. That being helped doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. The Memphis chapter's initiative made local news, then regional news, and that's when something unexpected happened. 3 other motorcycle clubs across Tennessee, chapters that had no formal affiliation with the Hells Angels, clubs that operated independently with their own traditions and territories, reached out to Marcus. They'd seen the coverage, read the stories, and they wanted to do the same thing. And here's what nobody expected. Jamal's story inspired 3 other motorcycle clubs in Tennessee to do the same thing. Dozens of homeless children now have families because one boy was brave enough to help a little girl in a park. The Iron Vipers in Nashville, the Roadhounds in Chattanooga, an independent club called the River Rats in Knoxville. All of them started their own versions of the program. All of them opened their clubhouses and their lives to children who needed them. Within 8 years, 47 children across Tennessee had found families through motorcycle clubs. 47 kids who'd been invisible, forgotten, or abandoned now had homes, structure, protection, love. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. These clubs, organizations that society often painted as dangerous, as criminal, as threats to be feared, were doing more for vulnerable children than most government programs. They weren't doing it for recognition or tax breaks or positive publicity. They were doing it because they understood what it meant to be cast out, to be judged, to be told you don't matter. Marcus was asked about it once during a local news interview that Jamal and Ella watched from the clubhouse couch. "Mr. Harlan, why do you think your organization has been so successful with these children when traditional systems struggle?" Marcus had thought about it for a moment, then answered simply, "Because we don't see them as problems to be solved. We see them as people who deserve a family. And maybe that's all any kid really needs, someone who sees them." But later that night, after the cameras left and the clubhouse settled into its evening rhythm, Marcus said something different, something quieter, something true. Jamal was doing homework at the dining table. Ella was practicing piano in the corner. The brotherhood was scattered throughout the building, living their lives in the comfortable chaos of family. Marcus stood in the doorway, watching all of it, and Zeke heard him whisper, "I thought I was saving him." Turns out he saved all of us. This story proves that the smallest act of kindness can change everything. If you believe people like Jamal and Ella deserve to be celebrated, smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I hunt down these stories to remind you that humanity is still good. Comment "Thank you, Jamal" down below if this story moved you. And if you know someone who's struggling, who feels invisible, share this video with them. Let them know they matter. Let them know their story isn't over. Because sometimes miracles don't just happen to one person. Sometimes they ripple outward, touching lives we'll never even know about. And it all started with a barefoot boy, a deaf little girl, and 30 seconds in a park that changed